The Nile River is one of the most important rivers in human history. It is long, winding, and seasonal in its behavior. For the people of ancient Egypt, it was not merely a river, but the single thread of life that held together their existence. Without it, the desert would have swallowed them, and their civilization would never have flourished. Year after year, they watched the water rise and fall, flooding the fields, nourishing the soil, and providing the basis for farming that fed millions. But here lies a curious detail. For centuries, many Egyptians believed that the behavior of the Nile was controlled by hippopotamuses. At first glance, this might sound strange to you. A hippo is just an animal, heavy and dangerous, yes, but not exactly a god of water. And yet for people living along the Nile, the connection between the hippo and the floods was natural, even obvious. To understand why, you have to imagine their world carefully, without rushing, without skipping to the spectacular. Let's start with the river itself. The annual flooding of the Nile was one of the most predictable and yet mysterious events in antiquity. It began every summer around the time of what we now call July, and it reached its peak in September. The waters spread out across the floodplain, leaving behind a thick layer of fertile black silt. This cycle of flood planting and harvest was the rhythm of Egyptian life, repeated endlessly. But the Egyptians did not know what we know today, that the rains in the Ethiopian highlands were responsible for the floodwaters. For them, the source of the flood was hidden, unreachable, and therefore open to myth and imagination. Now think of the hippopotamus. The hippo was a creature unlike any other in the Nile Valley. It spent its days submerged in the water, half hidden, emerging suddenly with a loud snort that startled fishermen and farmers alike. At night, it would leave the river, wander into fields, and trample crops. Sometimes it attacked boats, overturning them with its enormous bulk. Its mouth, when opened, was wide enough to frighten even the bravest hunter. For a people who tied their survival to the Nile, the hippo was a living symbol of the river's power, both life-giving and destructive. Egyptian art tells us a great deal about how the hippo was seen. In tomb paintings, hippos appear alongside scenes of the river, sometimes hunted, sometimes calmly resting. The goddess Taweret, who was associated with childbirth and protection, was often depicted as a hippopotamus standing upright, her heavy body transformed into a divine form. Here, we see how the hippo was not just an animal, but a spiritual presence. It represented fertility, chaos, danger, and yet also protection. How could one creature hold so many meanings? Perhaps it was because the Egyptians experienced the Nile in exactly the same way, gentle and nourishing one moment, overwhelming and deadly the next. The link between hippos and floods emerges more clearly when we consider the everyday experiences of ordinary Egyptians. Imagine a farmer living near the river in the Middle Kingdom, perhaps around 2000 BCE. His life is simple but fragile. Each year, he waits for the river to rise. If the floods are too low, his fields will dry and there will be famine. If they are too high, the waters will destroy his home and drown his crops. He prays for the just right flood. Now, during this anxious season, he sees hippos gathering in the shallows, wallowing in the water, stirring up mud, making the river seem alive. Is it really surprising that he might think these animals somehow controlled the waters themselves? Even the rulers of Egypt shared in this association. Pharaohs often boasted in inscriptions about hunting hippopotamuses. It was not just sport, it was a symbolic act. By killing a hippo, the king was demonstrating his ability to control chaos, to tame the forces of nature that threatened his people. In this way, the hunt became more than an activity. It was a ritual that reinforced the king's divine role as guardian of order. When a pharaoh stood triumphant over a slain hippo, he was not only a hunter. He was a protector of the flood, ensuring its balance and safety. The texts that survive from the Middle and New Kingdoms sometimes mention hippos in relation to divine power. For example, in certain hymns to the gods, the Nile is described as being stirred, awakened, or agitated by animals within it. Priests who performed rituals during the inundation may have called upon symbols of the hippo to represent this awakening of the waters. To the Egyptian imagination, the boundary between animal and divine was thin. A creature that lived in the river naturally had influence over the river itself. Now it is easy for us to dismiss this belief as superstition, but pause for a moment. Think of what the Egyptians did not know. They could not travel to the Ethiopian plateau to see the rains. They had no modern meteorology, no scientific models of hydrology. What they had was observation, tradition, and imagination. And when they observed the hippo, they saw a creature so powerful and unpredictable that it seemed to embody the Nile itself. In fact, the relationship between humans and hippos was so tense that hippo hunts became a recurring theme in Egyptian ritual. Even in funerary texts, like the Book of the Dead, the soul of the deceased is sometimes warned against hostile animals, including the hippopotamus. These references remind us that the hippo was never a neutral figure. It was a force to be respected, feared, and sometimes placated. Archaeologists have even found hippo bones in ceremonial contexts, suggesting that parts of the animal were used in rituals, perhaps to transfer its strength, or to symbolically control the forces it represented. In temples, priests may have chanted prayers while invoking the image of Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, to protect mothers in childbirth and households in times of danger. The same animal that trampled crops could also guard the vulnerable. This duality is at the heart of why the hippo became linked to the Nile flood. As you can see, what might first appear as a strange superstition actually reveals a deeper truth about Egyptian life. The hippo was a mirror for the river itself, sometimes generous, sometimes destructive, always powerful. To believe that hippos controlled the floods was not irrational. It was a way of making sense of an unpredictable world. But this raises a question worth considering. If hippos were believed to influence the Nile, how did the Egyptians attempt to control or manage this connection? Did they develop rituals, hunts, or offerings specifically to shape the floods through the hippos? Or was the belief more symbolic, a way of acknowledging the forces beyond human control? That is where we must turn next. Section 2. Rituals, Symbols, and the Administration of the Flood. When you think of ancient Egypt, you likely picture pyramids, temples, and statues of gods with animal heads. But beneath these grand images lies a quieter story, a story of ritual routines, careful observation, and the endless attempt to balance human life with the whims of the Nile. The belief that hippos controlled the floods was not only a matter of myth, it also seeped into the practical and bureaucratic systems that sustained Egyptian society. To see this, you must first understand how Egyptians treated the annual inundation. Every year when the waters began to rise, the event was marked with religious ceremonies. Priests gathered in temples along the river, offering prayers and sacrifices to Hapi, the god of the flood, who was often depicted as a plump, water-bearing man with pendulous breasts and a belly full of abundance. Hapi was the personification of the flood itself, and his presence reassured Egyptians that the river would once again nourish their fields. Yet even within this framework, the hippo lingered. While Hapi symbolized abundance, Taweret, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, part lion, represented the unpredictable and protective side of nature. Rituals during the inundation often included symbolic gestures aimed at keeping chaos at bay. One recurring theme in Egyptian religion is the battle between order Mayat and chaos Isfet. The hippo, with its dangerous nature, was frequently tied to the forces of Isfet. In temple reliefs, the god Seth associated with disorder was sometimes shown in the form of a hippopotamus or hunting one. Ritual hunts of hippos, staged by priests or even performed symbolically, reinforce the idea that chaos must be subdued in order for life to continue. The pharaoh himself was sometimes depicted spearing a hippo, an image that not only showed his physical strength, but his divine authority to control both animals and floods. But these rituals were not merely symbolic theater. They were tied to the rhythms of farming and taxation. The Nile flood was the central event of the agricultural calendar, and priests, scribes, and administrators worked together to measure and predict it. Here enters the quiet, almost tedious detail, the nilometer. These were stone structures with staircases or pillars, marked with measurements designed to record the level of the flood. The height of the water determined how much tax farmers would owe that year, since a good flood meant good crops, and a poor flood meant scarcity. Though the nilometer is often celebrated as an early scientific tool for the Egyptians, it was not separate from ritual. Priests measured the water, but they also recited prayers, acknowledging that divine forces, including the hippos that stirred the river, played a role in the outcome. This blending of the practical and the spiritual shows us something important. To the Egyptians, the river was not just a physical reality, but a living system of gods, animals, and signs. When the water rose to a certain mark, it was both a number and a divine message. If hippos were particularly active in a season emerging, often bellowing loudly or clashing in territorial fights, it could be read as a sign of how the flood would behave. Did the thrashing of the hippos suggest a violent inundation, or their calmness, a gentle one? These interpretations, while unscientific to us, offered meaning in an uncertain world. The hippo's influence extended into daily life in ways that might surprise you. For example, protective amulets, shaped like tawere, were common household items, especially for pregnant women and new mothers. These charms linked the health of the family to the protective power of the hippo goddess. In a society where infant mortality was high and childbirth risky, such protection was more than symbolic, it was essential. The fact that families wore hippo-shaped amulets during the same season as the Nile flood suggests that the two were connected in the Egyptian imagination. Both childbirth and the flood involved a dangerous but necessary passage. Both brought life, but also risk, and both required divine aid to ensure survival. Interestingly, we also find traces of hippos in Egyptian literature. Texts from the Middle Kingdom include tales and instructions in which animals play moral or symbolic roles. In some cases, the hippo appears as a metaphor for untamed strength or hidden danger. In others, it is a creature subdued by a hero. These stories were not just entertainment. They reflected the worldview of a people who lived alongside one of the most dangerous animals in Africa and who depended on the same river it inhabited. When a scribe copied down a tale of a man confronting a hippopotamus, it was not simply a story. It was a cultural rehearsal of humanity's fragile dominance over the Nile's forces. But perhaps the most striking evidence of the hippo's role comes from art and architecture. In temple reliefs, particularly those from the New Kingdom, we find repeated scenes of the king smiting a hippopotamus. These images are often accompanied by inscriptions declaring the king's power to preserve Ma'at, the cosmic order. On the surface, the image is violent, the king with a harpoon, the hippo writhing in pain. But symbolically, it is a reassurance to the people. Just as the king subdues the hippo, he also ensures that the floods will be beneficial and not destructive. Each image was a promise carved in stone. The forces of chaos embodied by the hippo would be kept under control. It is worth pausing here to imagine the daily grind behind these grand depictions. For every relief carved in stone, there were teams of artisans, scribes, and overseers who labored under the desert sun to produce them. For every ritual hunt or ceremonial offering, There were countless preparations, food collected for priests, water carried from the river incense, shipped in from distant lands. The spectacle of religion rested on an invisible foundation of routine labor, and all of it was tied in one way or another to the rhythms of the Nile and the animals that dwelled in it. This raises an important point. Egyptian beliefs about hippos and floods were not isolated superstitions, but part of a larger system of survival. In a land where famine could strike after a single poor flood, every effort, practical, spiritual, and symbolic, was directed toward ensuring balance. The hippo's role in this system was both feared and respected. Its presence reminded Egyptians that the river was not entirely theirs to control. They could measure it, pray over it, and tax it, but ultimately it belonged to forces greater than themselves. And so we return to a question. Did Egyptians truly believe that hippos controlled the floods? Or was this belief a way of expressing something deeper, that life itself was precarious, balanced between abundance and disaster? Perhaps, for them, there was no distinction. To say the hippo influenced the flood was simply another way of saying that the natural world was alive, unpredictable, and intertwined with human fate. Yet, there is still more to uncover. We have seen how ritual art and administration connected hippos to the floods. But what about the long-term consequences? Over centuries, how did this belief shape Egyptian politics, culture, and daily life? Did it fade as knowledge of the Nile sources grew, or did it persist, carried quietly through tradition? These questions bring us to the final part of our story, where we must consider how the hippo's symbolic power endured or diminished across the long span of Egyptian history. Section 3. Legacy of the Hippo and the Nile. When we look back across the centuries of Egyptian history, from the earliest dynasties to the Greco-Roman period, it is easy to think of the civilization as unchanging. After all, the art looks similar, the hieroglyphs remain recognizable, and the rituals of the Nile appear to repeat endlessly. Yet beneath this surface of continuity, ideas and symbols evolved, adapted, and sometimes faded. The belief that hippos controlled, or at least reflected, the power of the Nile flood was one of those ideas deeply rooted, widely expressed, but also subject to change as Egypt's knowledge and political landscape shifted. To understand this transformation, we must begin in the Old Kingdom around 2600 BCE. In this early period, when the pyramids were first built, the Nile's floods were at the very center of political authority. The pharaoh's legitimacy rested on his ability to guarantee stability, which in Egypt meant reliable floods. If the inundation failed, famine followed, and with famine came social unrest. Against this backdrop, the hippo emerged not just as an animal, but as a political symbol. Reliefs from this period show hippo hunts often staged by the king, emphasizing his role as master of chaos. By the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, the role of the hippo had expanded. Taweret, the protective goddess with the body of a hippopotamus, became one of the most widely venerated household deities. Families carved her image on amulets, painted her on walls, and included her in birth rituals. This period also saw the appearance of literary references to hippos, in which they served as metaphors for the untamed forces of nature. At the same time, scribes and priests were developing more systematic methods of observing the flood, as seen in the Nilometers. The hippo remained a figure of power, but now it was integrated into both religious practice and administrative life. The New Kingdom, beginning around 1550 BCE, brought further complexity. Egypt expanded its empire, stretching into Nubia and the Levant. Trade flourished, armies marched, and temples grew more elaborate. In this era of grand monuments, the symbolism of the hippo was sharpened. Seth, the god associated with disorder and violence, was increasingly depicted as a hippopotamus. In myths, Horus fought Seth in the form of a hippo, sometimes spearing him in dramatic fashion. These stories reinforced the image of the hippo as a vessel of chaos needing to be subdued. Pharaohs, such as Amenhotep III, commissioned vast reliefs, showing themselves harpooning hippos, repeating the message: the king was the guarantor of order, the master of the flood, the protector of Egypt. But even as the hippo retained its symbolic weight, the world was changing. Egyptians were learning more about the sources of the Nile. Expeditions into Nubia and beyond brought reports of distant lands where the river began. Priests may not have understood the rainfall patterns in the Ethiopian highlands, but they did recognize that the flood was connected to events beyond Egypt. Knowledge complicated myth, but it did not erase it. To the Egyptian mind, the hippo could still serve as a symbol of the forces behind the flood, even if the precise mechanics remained mysterious. As centuries passed, the Greeks and later the Romans took control of Egypt. These new rulers brought their own interpretations of Egyptian symbols. Greek writers such as Herodotus described the hippo with a mixture of awe and confusion, noting its size, strength, and dangerous nature. They recorded Egyptian practices of hunting and venerating the animal, but often with an outsider's eye. For the Greeks, the hippo was exotic, a curiosity of the Nile. For Egyptians, it remained part of the fabric of their religious and cultural life. Even in Roman times, amulets of Taweret continued to be made, showing the endurance of hippo symbolism. Yet there were signs of decline, as the centuries wore on. The hippo population in Egypt diminished. Hunting habitat loss and the growing density of human settlement along the Nile pushed the animals farther south. By the later Roman period, hippos were no longer common in Lower Egypt, and perhaps not even in Upper Egypt. The animal that had once been a living presence in the river became more of a memory preserved in art and ritual rather than in daily life. This fading presence likely weakened the direct association between hippos and floods, though the symbolic residue remained. So what is the legacy of this belief? On one level, it shows us how deeply the Egyptians tied their religious imagination to their environment. They did not separate the practical from the symbolic. The river was measured with careful marks on stone, yet also explained through gods and animals. The hippo's role as both destroyer and protector reflected the Egyptians' lived experience of the Nile, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel. To say that hippos controlled the floods was to give shape to uncertainty, to anchor human vulnerability in a visible creature. On another level, the belief illustrates the Egyptian obsession with balance. Life was a constant negotiation between abundance and scarcity, order and chaos, fertility and destruction. The hippo embodied that tension. It was dangerous enough to be feared, yet powerful enough to be revered. In domestic life, Taweret protected mothers and children. In political life, the pharaoh subdued the hippo to prove his mastery of the natural world. The same animal could nurture life and threaten it, reflecting the dual nature of the river itself. If you think about it carefully, this way of seeing the world is not so foreign to us. Even today, we seek symbols for forces we cannot control. We give names to hurricanes, speak of the wrath of wildfires, and imagine viruses as invisible enemies. Just as the Egyptians looked at the hippo and saw the Nile's floods, we look at natural disasters and dress them in metaphors of power and intent. It is a reminder that while science gives us explanations, symbolism gives us meaning. And so the hippo of the Nile still lingers not as a controller of floods, but as a lesson in how humans cope with uncertainty. For the Egyptians, to live by the Nile was to live by the grace of forces beyond their command. To make sense of those forces, they turned to the creatures around them. The hippo was more than an animal. It was a mediator between people and the river, a reminder that survival required both reverence and caution. Perhaps the most thought-provoking legacy is this. The Egyptians, by linking their survival to the hippo, admitted a truth that many civilizations forget, that humans are never separate from nature, but bound to it. Their symbols were not abstract inventions, but reflections of the world they inhabited daily. When the hippos roared in the river, Egyptians heard not just an animal, but the voice of the flood itself. And that leaves us with a lingering question. If the Egyptians could see such meaning in the hippo, what animals or symbols do we, in our own time, unconsciously elevate to explain forces we do not fully control? Story 2, Measuring the River, the long and tedious history of the Nilometer. Section 1, Watching the Water Rise. If the Nile River was the heartbeat of Egypt, then the Nilometer was its pulse monitor. Few instruments in history have been so dull in their appearance, yet so central to the survival of a civilization. At first glance, a Nilometer is not impressive. It is simply a staircase, a well, or a stone pillar, marked with careful measurements. But behind its unassuming design lay the very foundation of Egyptian agriculture, taxation, and governance. Without the Nilometer, Egyptians would have been at the mercy of the river, with no way of predicting or preparing for the future. The story begins, as always in Egypt, with the flood. Each year, as summer came, the river began to swell. It spread across the floodplain, covering fields and villages, leaving behind the fertile silt that allowed crops to grow. But the flood was never the same twice. One year, it might be too low, leaving fields dry and barren. Another year, it might be too high, drowning villages and washing away crops. Somewhere in the middle lay the perfect flood, high enough to nourish the land, but not so high as to destroy it. To manage this delicate balance, the Egyptians needed a way to measure and anticipate the flood. Out of this need came the Nilometer. The earliest Nilometers were simple structures built along the riverbank. Some were nothing more than a set of carved steps descending into the water, allowing priests or scribes to walk down and observe how far the water had risen. Over time, the design became more sophisticated. At Rhoda Island near Cairo, archaeologists have discovered a Nilometer dating to the early Islamic period, though its foundations go back much earlier. It is a deep cylindrical well connected to the Nile by channels with a central stone pillar marked in cubits, the ancient Egyptian unit of measurement. As the water rose in the well, priests could read the height on the pillar, announcing whether the flood would be abundant, insufficient, or excessive. But before the Nilometer became a tool of measurement, it was a tool of ritual. In the Old Kingdom, around 2600 BCE, the act of measuring the Nile was not just a practical task, but a sacred duty. Priests who descended the steps of a Nilometer did not simply read numbers. They performed ceremonies, recited prayers, and interpreted the results as divine messages. The Nile was the body of the god Hapi, and its rise and fall were signs of his favor or displeasure. The Nilometer, then, was both an instrument and an altar, a place where science and religion merged without contradiction. You might imagine the scene: a hot summer morning in Thebes, the river already swelling. A group of priests in linen garments gathers at the river's edge. One descends the staircase of the Nilometer, the water cool against the stone. He calls out the level measured in cubits, and the others recorded on papyrus. At the same time, offerings are made to the gods, incense is burned, and prayers are spoken. The measurement is not a cold number. It is a divine verdict on the year to come. As centuries passed, the Nilometer became entangled with the bureaucracy of Egypt. The state needed to know how much grain to expect in a given year, and how much tax could be levied on farmers. If the flood reached a certain level, say 16 cubits, it was a sign of abundance, and taxes would be set high. If it fell short, taxes might be lowered, though not always generously. In this way, the Nilometer became a tool of economic control, allowing the state to anticipate surplus or scarcity. It is one of the earliest examples of data collection being used for government planning. The connection between measurement and power is particularly evident in the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom periods. Inscriptions from this time often link the pharaoh's authority to his ability to ensure the right flood. Official proclamations describe the king as Lord of the Inundation, emphasizing his divine role in maintaining balance. Of course, the king had no control over rainfall in Ethiopia, but the Nilometer allowed his priests to appear as interpreters of divine will. When the water level was announced, it was framed as a gift of the gods, mediated by the pharaoh. The details of these measurements were not always shared widely. In many cases, the knowledge of the Nilometer's readings was closely guarded by priests, who then conveyed the results in ritualized announcements. This secrecy added to the aura of divine authority. Ordinary farmers did not descend into the Nilometer themselves. They waited to be told whether the flood was favorable. By controlling access to this knowledge, the state and the temple reinforced their role as intermediaries between people and river. What makes the Nilometer especially fascinating is its monotony. Year after year, the same process repeated. The water rose. The priests measured, the results were recorded, and taxes were adjusted. There was little drama, little spectacle, only routine. Yet this routine was the backbone of Egyptian life. Without it, famine would have struck more often, and the centralized state would have struggled to survive. It is a reminder that history is not always shaped by grand battles or sudden events. Sometimes it is built on the slow, steady accumulation of measurements carved into stone. The Nilometer also reflects a broader theme in Egyptian culture, the obsession with order. The concept of Ma'at, the cosmic balance of truth and justice, extended into every aspect of life. To measure the flood was to bring order to chaos, to transform the unpredictable rise of the river into something knowable. Each cubit, marked on the stone, was a line of control drawn against the uncertainty of nature. The Nilometer was in its way a monument to Ma'at quiet, precise, and endlessly repetitive. Of course, the Nilometer was not perfect. Floods could still surprise and predictions could fail. Records suggest that during periods of especially low floods, famine gripped Egypt despite the measurements. In such times, the blame might fall on priests, scribes, or even the pharaoh himself, accused of failing to honor the gods properly. Rituals would be intensified, offerings increased, and ceremonies held to plead for better floods. The Nilometer could not prevent disaster, but it gave the Egyptians a framework for responding to it both practically and spiritually. One cannot help but wonder what it felt like to be a farmer in these times waiting for news of the flood. Did you listen anxiously for the priest's announcement? Did you believe the river rose according to the God's will? Or did you quietly observe the waters yourself, trusting your own eyes more than the temple's words? The Nilometer was a tool of control, but it was also a tool of reassurance. It told people that the flood could be known, that the future was not entirely hidden. And yet the question lingers, was the Nilometer truly a scientific instrument? Or was it a religious one? Did the Egyptians see it as a way to measure nature, or as a way to hear the voice of the gods? Perhaps, as with the hippos of our previous story, there was no distinction. The measurement was the message, the number was the omen, and the river was both a natural and divine force. This ambiguity leads us to the next part of our journey. For while the Nilometer began as a simple staircase and ritual site, it would later evolve into more complex forms, tied ever more closely to the administration of the state and the lives of ordinary Egyptians. The story of the Nilometer is not only about measurement, but about power politics and survival. But what did it mean in practical terms for taxes, food distribution, and the lives of the countless farmers who depended on the Nile? That is the next chapter in the long, boring, but essential history of the Nilometer. Section 2. The Nilometer and the machinery of the state. If you lived in ancient Egypt, you would not think of the Nile flood as a natural event alone. It was also a matter of government. The water level determined how much grain would be harvested, and that in turn determined how much grain would be collected as tax. The Nilometer, therefore, was not just a religious or scientific tool. It was a bureaucratic one. By tracking the river, the state could track its people. From the Old Kingdom onward, Egypt developed one of the most sophisticated systems of agricultural taxation in the ancient world. The logic was simple. Farmers did not own their land outright. The land belonged to the gods, and therefore to the pharaoh, who ruled as their earthly representative. Farmers cultivated the land, but they paid a portion of their harvest to the state in recognition of this divine ownership. The exact portion, however, depended on the yield, and the yield depended on the flood. This is where the Nilometer came in. By measuring the height of the inundation, scribes and officials could predict how much grain would grow. If the flood reached a high mark, perhaps 16 or 17 cubits, it meant the land would be fertile and taxes would be heavy. If it fell short, say 12 cubits, the harvest would be meager and taxes might be reduced. This was not generosity on the part of the state, but pragmatism. If taxes were set too high in a year of scarcity, farmers would revolt or starve. If taxes were too low in a year of abundance, the state would lose revenue. The Nilometer gave the state a guide balancing its demands with the river's supply. Of course, this system required records, and records required scribes. The Egyptian scribe was the quiet backbone of the state, seated cross-legged with a reed pen and a palette of ink writing in careful hieroglyphs or hieratic script. Each year after the priest measured the water, scribes recorded the reading on papyrus. These records were stored in temple archives and palace granaries, where they guided decisions about taxation and grain distribution. To read these documents today is to glimpse the administrative mind of ancient Egypt, endlessly focused on numbers, harvests, and rations. But behind the numbers lay power. The Nilometer was never a neutral tool. Its readings could be interpreted in ways that suited political needs. If the flood was generous, officials might still claim it was modest, lowering expectations and keeping surplus grain for the state. If the flood was poor, the government could use it as justification for tightening control, extracting loyalty, in exchange for famine relief. In this way, the Nilometer became a tool not only of measurement, but of manipulation. We see this most clearly in the New Kingdom, when Egypt expanded its empire and wealth flowed in from abroad. Temples became major landholders, controlling vast estates and collecting grain as offerings. Priests who often controlled the Nilometers could use their privileged knowledge of the flood to strengthen their own power. By announcing favorable or unfavorable readings, they influenced both taxation and the distribution of resources. The Nilometer's measurements, hidden in the shadows of temple walls, carried enormous weight in the political balance between king, priests, and people. The bureaucracy surrounding the Nilometer also extended into the physical infrastructure of Egypt. Granaries were built to store surplus grain, their mud brick walls rising above village rooftops. These granaries were filled or emptied according to the predictions of the flood. In good years, they brimmed with wheat and barley, guarded by officials who recorded every sack. In poor years, they became centers of survival where grain was rationed to prevent starvation. The very rhythm of daily bread, the flat loaves and jars of beer that sustained Egyptians, was tied to the readings of the Nilometer. Yet, for all its importance, the Nilometer was a curiously modest monument. Unlike the pyramids or great temples, it was not built to impress. Its steps and pillars were practical, its inscriptions sparse, and yet its power was immense. The farmer in his field, the scribe in his chamber, the priest in his temple, and the king in his palace All were linked by the same set of cubit marks carved into stone. Each measurement rippled outward into society, determining who would eat well, who would pay dearly, and who might starve. There is a certain monotony to this system, and perhaps that is its most striking feature. Year after year, century after century, the process repeated, the river rose. The Nilometer was read, taxes were set, grain was collected. Few things in history are so consistent over such a long span of time. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreign conquerors arrived. Gods changed their names, but the Nilometer continued its quiet work. Even in the Islamic period, long after the last pharaohs had been buried, Nilometers were still being used to measure the Nile. Some were rebuilt, repaired, and expanded, but the principle remained the same. To know the flood was to know the fate of Egypt. But what did this mean for the ordinary Egyptian? For the farmer, the Nilometer was not a distant tool, but a constant presence in his life. When he saw the water rising each summer, he did not measure it himself. He waited for the announcement from priests or officials. He knew that this pronouncement would shape his year, how much grain he must surrender, how much food his family would keep, whether he could repair his home, whether he could marry off a daughter or buy a new plow. The flood was not only water on the fields, it was law written in stone. In this sense, the Nilometer reminds us of the double edge of bureaucracy. On one side, it provided stability, allowing the Egyptian state to endure for millennia. On the other, it imposed a relentless control over ordinary lives, reducing them to numbers and measurements. For every loaf of bread baked in a village oven, there was a line of ink on papyrus, a cubit mark on stone, a calculation made in a temple chamber. Egypt's grandeur was built not only on pyramids and monuments, but on this quiet machinery of measurement. And yet, one question lingers: how did the people themselves view this system? Did they accept the Nilometer's readings as divine truth? Or did they resent the way their labor was measured and taxed? Did they see in the cubit marks the hand of the gods or the hand of the state? To answer this, we must look more closely at the social and cultural side of the Nilometer, how it shaped festivals, rituals, and the rhythms of daily life. That will take us into the final part of this story. Section 3. The Flood, the Festival, and the Legacy of Measurement. The Nilometer was at its heart a device for measurement. Yet in Egypt, measurement was never only a matter of numbers. Every cubit carved on its stone, every step descending into the water, carried a weight of meaning that was both practical and sacred. If Section 2 showed us how the Nilometer fed the bureaucracy of the state, Section 3 brings us closer to how it shaped the cultural imagination, the rhythms of festivals, and the lives of ordinary people who waited anxiously each year to hear its verdict. Let us begin with the Festival of the Inundation. Each summer, when the Nile began to rise, Egyptians marked the event with ceremonies of thanksgiving. The festival was not simply a celebration of water, but a recognition of life itself. Offerings were made to Hapi, the god of the flood, depicted as a plump figure, with lotus and papyrus plants, the emblems of Upper and Lower Egypt. Songs were sung in his honor, praising him as the one who waters the fields created by Ra to nourish all who thirst. At the center of this festival, the Nilometer readings were announced. The priests who descended its steps or consulted its wells were not merely reporting numbers, they were declaring divine favor or displeasure. For the farmer waiting on the riverbank, the announcement was both exciting and nerve-wracking. A favorable reading meant abundance. His fields would be fertile, his granaries full, his children fed. A poor reading meant hardship, perhaps even famine. Yet the announcement was made with ritual solemnity, wrapped in prayers and incense. The priest did not say, "The flood is 14 cubits this year." He said, in effect, "The gods have blessed us with a flood of 14 cubits." The number was a verdict from the heavens. This blending of measurement and ritual is one of the most characteristic features of Egyptian thought. Unlike later Greek science, which sought to separate observation from belief, the Egyptians saw no contradiction in combining the two. For them, the Nilometer was both a scientific tool and a sacred shrine. The very act of measurement was a ritual, an acknowledgement that human survival depended on forces greater than themselves. Beyond the temples, the Nilometer shaped the rhythms of work. Farmers timed their planting according to the flood. When the water receded, they sowed wheat and barley in the rich silt left behind. The state organized labor crews to repair dikes, canals, and irrigation basins, tasks that began only after the Nilometer gave its reading. Thus, a farmer's hoe striking the earth, a mason's hand laying mud brick, and a scribe's reed pen scratching papyrus were all synchronized by the cubit marks on stone. But the Nilometer's influence was not only economic or agricultural. It also extended into the spiritual and personal realms. Amulets shaped like Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, linked to childbirth and protection, were often worn during the flood season. Families drew connections between the swelling river and the swelling belly of pregnancy, both dangerous, both promising new life. Just as the Nilometer measured the river, midwives and healers prayed to Taweret to measure and protect the body. The imagery of the flood seeped into metaphors for fertility, renewal, and rebirth. As centuries passed, the Nilometer also became a site of continuity, a reassuring presence in a world of change. Dynasties collapsed, foreign invaders came and went. But the river continued to rise and fall, and the Nilometer continued to measure it. Greek rulers, after Alexander the Great, adopted the Nilometer into their own administration. The Ptolemies, though, foreign recognized that to govern Egypt meant to control its grain. They relied on Nilometer readings to predict harvests and set taxes, just as pharaohs had done. In this way, the instrument bridged cultural divides, surviving through adaptation. The Roman period carried this forward even further. Roman emperors saw Egypt as the empire's breadbasket, shipping vast amounts of grain to feed the city of Rome. The Nilometer readings determined not only the fate of Egyptian farmers, but the diets of distant citizens along the Mediterranean. When the water was low, famine could spread not just in Egypt, but across the empire. The Nilometer, still a quiet staircase, or well by the river, had become a linchpin of imperial survival. Islamic rulers after the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE continued the tradition. The Nilometer at Rhoda Island in Cairo, built in the 9th century under the Abbasid caliphs, stands as a direct descendant of the ancient practice. Its central stone pillar, inscribed with measurements in cubits, was used each year to declare the flood level. Even then, the announcement was made with ceremony, blending observation with religious pronouncement. When the reading was favorable, public celebrations were held. When it was poor, fasting and prayer were called for. More than 2,000 years after the first Nilometers, the ritual of measuring the Nile still structured the lives of Egyptians. Yet as the centuries wore on, the meaning of the Nilometer began to shift. Advances in engineering allowed canals, dams, and reservoirs to regulate the Nile's waters more directly. Modern hydrology eventually revealed the true source of the flood, the rains in the Ethiopian highlands. With this knowledge, the symbolic weight of the Nilometer began to fade. By the time the Aswan High Dam was built in the 20th century, permanently ending the annual flood, the Nilometer had become a relic, a monument to a vanished way of life. And so we are left with a curious paradox. The Nilometer was one of the simplest instruments ever devised, just stone steps and markings. Yet it was also one of the most powerful, shaping the politics, economy, and spirituality of Egypt for more than 3,000 years. Its endurance speaks to the Egyptian genius for continuity, for finding stability in the midst of uncertainty. To measure the river was to measure life itself. To watch the water rise was to watch the fate of a civilization unfold. And perhaps that is why the Nilometer still captures our imagination today. For in our own time, we also measure endlessly. We measure rainfall and temperature inflation and unemployment stock markets and population growth. We turn the uncertainties of life into numbers, just as the Egyptians did with their cubits on stone. But do our numbers, like theirs, carry meanings beyond the practical? Do we too, perhaps unconsciously wrap our measurements in rituals, announcements, and symbolic weight? The Nilometer reminds us that measurement is never just measurement. It is always interpretation, always power, always meaning. And so the question lingers: what will future generations say of our own Nilometers, the tools with which we measure the uncertain floods of modern life? Story 3. Bread, Beer, and Bureaucracy. Feeding Egypt through Grain Storage, Section 1. The Grain of Civilization. When you think of ancient Egypt, towering pyramids and golden tombs might come to mind. But beneath those monuments lay something far more essential: loaves of bread and jars of beer. Without them, there would have been no pyramids, no temples, no great works of art or literature. Bread and beer were the daily sustenance of Egyptians, the foundation upon which their entire society rested. And at the heart of this system was the careful, often monotonous practice of grain storage. Egypt was blessed, or perhaps cursed, with a rhythm that demanded storage. Each year, the Nile flooded, depositing fertile silt across the floodplain. Farmers planted wheat and barley in this rich soil, harvested it after a few months, and then faced a long dry season before the next flood. Unlike regions with multiple growing seasons, Egypt had essentially one harvest per year. That meant that survival depended on storing enough grain to last until the next flood, and sometimes beyond. The Egyptians understood this early. Archaeological evidence from pre-dynastic times, even before the pharaohs, shows mud brick silos built to store surplus grain. By the Old Kingdom, these storage facilities had become massive, often organized by temples and estates. Some were simple round silos made of mud brick. Others were long rectangular magazines with vaulted roofs, aligned neatly like cells in a honeycomb. Their construction may not inspire awe, but they were monuments in their own way, monuments to survival. Imagine a granary in a small village around 2500 BCE. The walls are thick, designed to keep out rodents. The roof is low, keeping the interior cool. Narrow openings near the top allow workers to pour in grain after the harvest. When grain is needed, laborers remove it from a small hatch at the bottom, ensuring a steady flow while older grain is used first. The system is simple, repetitive, and efficient. Each day, scribes record how much is added or removed, tallying the amounts in neat columns of hieroglyphs. To the villagers, these records are not abstract. They determine how much food will reach their families during the lean months. Bread was the primary food made from emmer wheat, a hearty grain with a coarse texture. The bread was not the soft, fluffy kind you might imagine today, but heavy, dense, and sometimes gritty with bits of sand from the grinding stones. Beer brewed from barley was equally essential. Thick and nourishing, it was consumed daily by adults and children alike. Together, bread and beer provided most of the calories in the Egyptian diet. Vegetables, fruits, and meat were supplements, luxuries by comparison. The phrase bread and beer even became shorthand for sustenance itself, appearing in texts as a way to describe rations, wages, or offerings to the gods. Grain storage was not only about feeding families, it was about feeding the state. Pharaohs collected grain as tax, storing it in massive central granaries. These reserves sustained royal building projects, fed soldiers on campaigns, and supported the priesthood. When we picture workers hauling blocks for the pyramids, we should also picture them queuing at granaries, receiving their daily ration of bread and beer. These rations were not payment in coin, but in calories drawn from the stored harvest of the Nile. The pyramids, in this sense, were built as much by bread as by stone. The bureaucracy behind this system was immense. Scribes kept endless records of grain in and grain out. Clay seal impressions found in excavations show the official marks used to secure granary doors and jars. Each sack of wheat, each jar of beer, was counted and accounted for. The monotony of these records, lists upon lists of names, numbers, and amounts, might seem dull to us, but they reveal a society obsessed with accountability. To control grain was to control Egypt itself. Of course, grain storage also meant grain distribution. In times of plenty, granaries brimmed with a surplus. In times of famine, they became centers of survival. Relief inscriptions tell us that during low floods, when harvests failed, pharaohs opened the granaries to feed the people. These acts were celebrated as signs of divine kingship. The ruler who opened the storehouses was seen as a savior. Yet famine also revealed the harshness of the system. When reserves ran low, rationing became strict, and the poorest often suffered most. Grain was both a blessing and a tool of control. The religious dimension of grain should not be overlooked. Temples received vast quantities of grain as offerings, which were then redistributed to priests' workers and sometimes the poor. Grain was also offered symbolically to the gods, baked into bread or brewed into beer for ritual feasts. The cycle of planting, harvesting, storing, and offering was woven into the rhythm of worship. To eat bread and drink beer was not only to live, but to participate in a divine order that linked humans, gods, and the river itself. Even the afterlife was imagined in terms of grain. Tomb inscriptions often included the phrase, "thousands of bread and beer," a promise that the deceased would never go hungry in eternity. Models of granaries complete with miniature workers have been found in tombs, ensuring that the dead would have access to grain forever. In this way, the practice of storage extended beyond practical survival into the realm of eternal sustenance. But grain storage was not without its problems. Grain could spoil, rot, or attract pests. To prevent this, Egyptians developed methods of drying and cleaning grain before storage. Granaries were carefully designed to minimize moisture, and their mud brick walls were often plastered to reduce cracks. Still, losses were inevitable. Scribes accounted for this in their records, noting expected spoilage. Even in death, the bureaucracy marched on a scribe's neat column. Might show 100 sacks received, 95 delivered, 5 lost to rot. These numbers, dull and repetitive, were the hidden mathematics of survival. The importance of grain storage also made it a target. In times of unrest, granaries were looted, and control over them became a prize in political struggles. During the first intermediate period, when central authority collapsed, inscriptions describe local rulers hoarding grain, using it to secure loyalty. In such times, the granary was more valuable than the temple or the palace. Whoever controlled the food controlled the people. So when we ask how Egypt sustained its civilization for 3,000 years, the answer is not only pyramids and temples, but mud brick silos and sealed jars. The grandeur of Egypt rested on the dull, repetitive work of farmers filling granaries, scribes recording amounts, and laborers distributing rations. Bread and beer were the daily miracle, as essential as the rising of the sun. And yet one might wonder, how did ordinary Egyptians feel about this system? Did they see the granary as a lifeline, a place of security, or as a symbol of control, a reminder of their dependence on the state? Did they find comfort in the routine of filling and emptying the silos, or did they resent the endless tallying of scribes? These questions lead us into the deeper layers of this story, into the bureaucracy that managed the grain, the rituals that sanctified it, and the ways in which food became both sustenance and symbol. Section 2. Counting the loaves, Measuring the jars. If Section 1 showed us how grain storage was the foundation of Egyptian survival, Section 2 draws us into the machinery that managed it. For ancient Egypt was not only a land of fertile fields, but also a land of scribes, seal-bearers, and overseers, who turned harvests into numbers, numbers into records, and records into power. Grain was more than food. It was a currency, a symbol of divine favor, and the lifeblood of the bureaucracy. Let us begin with the scribes, for without them, the system would have collapsed. The scribe was trained from boyhood, bent over tablets of wood or shards of limestone, copying lines of hieratic script until his hand was steady. He learned not only letters, but numbers, fractions, and tables. His task was to count, to measure, and to record. When the harvest came in, scribes stood by the granaries with tally sticks and reed pens, writing down each sack of wheat or barley as it was poured inside. They noted its owner, its origin, and its weight. These records were stored in temple archives or palace storerooms where other scribes reviewed and cross-checked them. A single transaction might look dull to us from the estate of Nasamon, 120 sacks of barley, delivered to the granary of the temple of Amun, overseer Men-Keper-Zeneb. But multiply this by thousands upon thousands of entries, year after year, and you see the scale of the system. The bureaucracy of Egypt was not built on speeches or decrees, but on endless lines of ink recording grain. Grain was also a form of wage. Workers, soldiers, and even craftsmen were often paid in rations of bread and beer. At Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans who built the royal tombs, records survive of how each family received their monthly rations, sacks of barley, jars of beer, sometimes a measure of fish or vegetables. These payments were not optional. They were the way the state ensured loyalty and labor. When rations failed, workers protested as they did during the reign of Ramesses III. Their strike, the first recorded in history, was not about lofty ideals, but about missing deliveries of bread and beer. The granary, in other words, was not just storage, but a labor contract binding individuals to the state. Temples were also central to this system. Every major temple had its own estates, fields, and granaries, managed by priests and overseers. Offerings to the gods were often made in the form of bread and beer produced from this stored grain. After being ritually presented, these offerings were redistributed to the priesthood and temple staff. Thus the gods were fed, the priests were fed, and the system reinforced itself. The daily offering of bread to Amun, or Osiris, was not only a religious act, but a logistical one, dependent on harvests, storage, and careful record-keeping. The bureaucracy even extended into the design of the granaries themselves. Large state granaries were often built in clusters, with long rectangular magazines arranged side by side. Each had a single entry point sealed with clay impressions, stamped with official marks. Breaking a seal without authorization was a serious crime, sometimes punished by death. Seal impressions, found by archaeologists, bear the names of officials, showing us how tightly grain was guarded. Every jar, every sack, every entry and exit had to pass through the hands of the bureaucracy. And yet, despite this rigid system, corruption was possible. In texts from the New Kingdom, we find complaints about dishonest officials skimming grain from storehouses or scribes altering records. The granary, like any treasure house, was tempting. Controlling it meant controlling food, and controlling food meant controlling people. The bureaucracy tried to limit such abuses through inspections and audits, but no system was perfect. Grain was life, and life was always vulnerable to theft. The monotony of this system is striking. Picture the annual cycle harvest brought in grain threshed and winnowed sacks carried to the granary. Scribes recording amounts, seals stamped rations distributed, offerings presented, and taxes tallied. Year after year, century after century, this process repeated with little variation. while dynasties rose and fell while wars came and went. The scribes at the granary doors continued their work writing the same kinds of numbers in the same kinds of ink. But monotony was also stability. The Egyptian state endured for 3 millennia, in part because of this unchanging cycle. The granaries provided a buffer against famine, the rations sustained workers, and the offerings kept the gods satisfied. The system might not have been fair. It burdened farmers heavily, and priests grew rich from temple estates. But it was resilient. The bureaucracy of bread and beer carried Egypt through good years and bad. The spiritual weight of grain storage also grew over time. Just as tombs contained models of granaries to feed the dead, so too did religious texts emphasize the divine order of abundance. Hymns to Osiris praised him as Lord of the granaries, the one who filled the storehouses with plenty. In this way, the bureaucracy of storage was mirrored in the heavens. The gods themselves were imagined as grainkeepers, and the afterlife as an eternal harvest. One might think this constant focus on grain would make life feel constrained, reduced to survival. And yet for Egyptians, bread and beer were not only necessities, but symbols of contentment. Texts describe feasts where guests were offered bread, beer, and meat. Even in modest households, to share bread and beer was to affirm friendship and kinship. The bureaucracy, with its endless records and granaries, ensured that this daily joy could continue. And so we must pause and ask, was the granary a prison binding Egyptians to an endless cycle of work and ration? Or was it a lifeline, ensuring their survival in a land where famine always loomed? Did the scribes, who counted sacks of grain, see themselves as keepers of life, or merely as clerks in a dull and thankless system? The answer perhaps lies in the next part of the story, in the crises that tested the system, the famines that revealed its weaknesses, and the ways Egyptians turned to grain, not only as sustenance, but as a symbol of divine justice. Section 3: Famine Feast and the Eternal Loaf. Egypt's relationship with grain was never a simple story of abundance. For every year of full granaries and contentment, there was always the shadow of famine. The Nile, though dependable, was not unchanging. Floods could fail, rains could falter, and when they did, the entire system of storage, taxation, and distribution was put to the test. If bread and beer were the foundation of Egyptian life, then famine was the crack in that foundation, exposing the fragility of a civilization so deeply tied to a single harvest. Records of famine appear as early as the First Intermediate Period. C. 2200 BCE, when the collapse of central authority left local rulers to fend for themselves. Inscriptions from this time describe empty storehouses and starving populations. One governor boasted that he had fed the hungry in years of want and opened the granaries when others hoarded grain. His words remind us that granaries were more than storage, they were instruments of power. To open the doors of a granary was a political act, one that could win loyalty or cement authority. Later periods give us further glimpses. A famous text known as the Famine Stela, though written much later in the Ptolemaic period, looks back to the reign of King Djoser in the Old Kingdom. It tells of a 7-year famine in which the Nile failed to rise. Djoser, desperate, turned to his priest Imhotep, who revealed that the floods came from the god Khnum at Elephantine. By making offerings to Khnum, Djoser restored the floods and saved Egypt. Though legendary, the story reflects a real anxiety. Famine was always a possibility, and grain storage, while vital, could not guarantee plenty. The Middle Kingdom offers a more administrative view. Records from this time show careful rationing during years of low floods. Scribes calculated who would receive grain, how much, and for how long. The monotony of these lists, columns of fractions, allocations to workers, priests, or soldiers, masks the human reality. families living on half rations, children going hungry, temples debating whether to feed their own staff or the wider community. Grain, which in good times was a symbol of abundance in bad times, became a measure of scarcity. In the New Kingdom, when Egypt reached the height of its power, grain played an even broader role. Vast estates in Nubia and the Levant sent grain back to Egypt's swelling state granaries. Foreign tribute often arrived in the form of sacks of wheat stacked high in temple courtyards. This surplus gave the pharaohs confidence to launch wars, build monuments, and support lavish priesthoods. But even then, the possibility of famine lingered. In letters from officials, we find warnings about poor harvests, requests for emergency grain shipments, and complaints about mismanagement. The machinery of storage and distribution never rested. The most human glimpse of this system under strain comes from Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb builders. During the reign of Ramesses III, workers there went on strike, the first recorded in history, because their rations of bread and beer had not been delivered. These artisans who carved the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings refused to work until their grain was supplied. Their protest shows us the absolute dependence of even skilled workers on the granary system. Without their monthly rations, their families starved. The strike was not about wages and coin, but about survival in bread. But famine was not only a social or political crisis, it was also a religious one. When the Nile failed, Egyptians asked why. Were the gods displeased? Had the rituals been neglected? Hymns and prayers from such times plead with Hapi Osiris and Khnum to restore abundance. Priests intensified offerings, festivals were held, and kings proclaimed themselves as restorers of plenty. To feed the people in famine was not only good politics, it was a sacred duty. Pharaohs were remembered for opening the granaries as much as for winning battles. In Egyptian ideology, to provide bread was to embody Ma'at, the cosmic balance of justice and order. The symbolism of bread and beer also deepened in times of scarcity. In tomb inscriptions, the promise of bread and beer in the afterlife took on greater weight. If famine haunted earthly life, then the afterlife was imagined as a place of eternal abundance, where fields were always fertile granaries, always full, and loaves and jars never ran out. The bureaucracy of food thus extended beyond life itself, ensuring that even the dead were not left hungry. By the late period, and into the Greco-Roman era, Egypt's grain took on global significance. The Nile Valley became the breadbasket of empires. Under the Ptolemies, grain, exports to the Mediterranean, fed growing cities. Under the Romans, Egypt supplied a vast portion of Rome's grain, shipped from Alexandria to the capital. In these centuries, the granaries of Egypt no longer fed only Egyptians, they fed the world. A low flood in the Nile could mean empty markets in Rome, famine in distant provinces, and unrest across the empire. The dull, repetitive act of measuring and storing grain in Egyptian villages rippled outward into the politics of entire civilizations. Even in the Islamic period, the system endured. The Nilometer still measured, the flood taxes were still set, according to harvests, and granaries still stored the surplus. Bread and beer, later bread, and other staples remained the daily rations of life. For thousands of years, the same rhythm continued: sow, reap, store, ration, record. It is one of the longest-lasting bureaucratic systems in human history, outlasting dynasties, invasions, and religious transformations. And yet, behind its endurance lay fragility. A single failed flood could still bring hunger. A corrupt official could still divert grain. A distant war could still disrupt shipments. Egyptians lived always in the shadow of famine, even while surrounded by full granaries. Their survival depended not only on the abundance of the Nile, but on the discipline of the bureaucracy. So what is the legacy of Egypt's bread and beer system? On one level, It shows the extraordinary resilience of a society that turned food into numbers, numbers into records, and records into stability. On another, it reminds us that survival is never guaranteed. The Egyptians knew this well. They measured, recorded, and stored, but they also prayed, offered, and imagined eternal abundance. They balanced the practical with the symbolic, the bureaucratic with the spiritual. And perhaps that is why their story still resonates. For even today, our lives are shaped by the storage and distribution of food. We may not bow before gods of the flood, but we watch the price of grain on global markets, the harvest reports from distant countries, the shelves of supermarkets. Like the Egyptians, we depend on unseen systems of storage and distribution. And like them, we sometimes forget how fragile those systems can be. The Egyptians left behind pyramids and temples, but they also left behind a quieter monument, the granary. Its mud brick walls and sealed doors may not inspire awe, but they sustained millions of lives. They remind us that civilization is not built only on stone and gold, but on bread and beer counted and stored year after year. And so we are left with a question. If our modern world depends as much on food systems as ancient Egypt did, how will future generations judge the way we measured, stored, and shared our daily bread? Story 4. The Pharaoh's Tax Collectors. The Monotony of Ancient Administration. Section 1. The Weight of a Harvest. When we think of ancient Egypt, we often imagine the pharaoh resplendent in gold, standing before temples and monuments carved with his likeness. Yet the real foundation of pharaonic power was not gold or stone, but taxes. Behind every monument stood the labor of thousands, and behind that labor stood the bureaucracy that collected, counted, and redistributed resources. In Egypt, the face of that bureaucracy was not always the king or the priest, but the tax collector, the official who turned the sweat of farmers into the wealth of the state. The Egyptian tax system was as old as the state itself. From the earliest dynasties, rulers claimed ownership of the land, asserting that all produce ultimately belonged to the gods and their earthly representative, the pharaoh. Farmers worked the land, but a portion of their harvest was always due as tax. This principle, simple in theory, became immensely complex in practice. How much was due? Who collected it? Where was it stored? The answers to these questions were written not in lofty decrees, but in the daily grind of administration. Let us imagine a farmer in Middle Kingdom Egypt around 1900 BCE. He has just harvested his wheat, cut with copper sickles, and gathered into bundles. His family threshes the grain, separating the kernels from the stalks. As the grain is measured and bagged, a tax official arrives accompanied by scribes and sometimes guards. The official does not harvest, he records. The scribe notes the number of sacks, the measure in hekat, the Egyptian unit of volume, and the portion owed to the state. Perhaps it is 1/5, perhaps more. The farmer's work is not finished until the sacks are carried to the local granary, sealed with clay stamped with the mark of the overseer. Only then can the farmer take home what remains. This was the rhythm of Egyptian taxation, production, measurement, deduction, and record. It was relentless, repetitive, and inescapable. Taxes were not paid in coin, but in kind grain, cattle, linen, fish, or labor. Everything produced by the land or by human hands could be taxed. Even fishermen and herdsmen who did not farm grain were required to contribute. Papyrus documents survive listing taxes in honey, oil, fruit, and even geese. The state claimed not only the land, but the bounty of river field and workshop alike. The bureaucracy that managed this system was immense. At the top stood the vizier, the pharaoh's chief administrator, responsible for overseeing the entire tax apparatus. Beneath him were provincial governors, temple overseers, and a hierarchy of scribes who recorded and checked every delivery. The system worked through redundancy. One scribe measured the grain, another checked his figures, and a third recorded them again in a central register. Errors were punished, dishonesty scrutinized. Clay ceilings on granary doors carried the names of multiple officials, ensuring accountability. The bureaucracy was slow, methodical, and often tedious, but it endured for millennia. To the farmer, however, taxation was not an abstract system, but a personal burden. Tomb scenes sometimes show officials beating peasants who tried to hide grain or resist taxation. In one satirical papyrus, tax collectors are described as harsh men who take more than their due, demanding not only grain, but also bribes of beer or fish. The image of the tax collector was not a beloved one. He was necessary, feared, and resented. And yet taxes were the lifeblood of the state. Without them, the pharaoh could not build temples, wage wars, or support the vast priesthoods. Taxes fed workers on royal projects, paid soldiers in grain rations, and supplied offerings for daily rituals. When a priest poured beer before a statue of a moon, it had begun as a farmer's tax. When a soldier marched to Nubia, he carried bread made from taxed wheat. The monuments that still rise in the desert were built not only from stone, but from taxed labor and resources. The monotony of administration extended into the smallest details. Surviving papyri from the Middle and New Kingdoms contain lists upon lists of taxed goods. One document might record, from the field of Panesi, 12 sacks of barley; from the field of Hori, 8 sacks; from the herd of Kamwaset, 3 oxen; from the estate of the temple of Ptah, 40 sacks of emmer. Another might list deliveries to a granary, received on the 10th day of the month of Paupi, 25 sacks from the district of the west, inspected and sealed by the scribe Ani. These records, dry and repetitive, are the true heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. Taxes were also paid in labor. The corvée system required peasants to spend part of the year working on state projects, building canals, hauling stones, or maintaining dikes. This was as much a tax as grain. For the farmer, it meant weeks away from his fields, his family left to manage without him. Yet corvée labor was what built the monuments that tourists still admire. Each block raised on the pyramid, each canal dug for irrigation, was in part a tax payment. The relationship between temples and taxes was especially complex. Temples were both beneficiaries and administrators of taxation. They received vast amounts of grain and goods as offerings, much of it redistributed to priests and temple workers. At the same time, temples owned estates whose produce was taxed like any other. The wealth of temples made them both powerful and dependent on the system, reinforcing the link between bureaucracy and religion. To keep all of this functioning, the state relied on endless paperwork. Scribes copied and recopied documents, creating archives of tax rolls, receipts, and inventories. These records were reviewed in audits where discrepancies could mean punishment. A farmer who failed to deliver his due might face confiscation of livestock or even beating. An official who misreported might lose his post. The bureaucracy had teeth even if its work seemed dull. Yet behind this rigidity lay a fragile balance. Too much taxation could drive peasants to ruin. Too little could weaken the state. Famine complicated matters further. In years of low floods, taxes might be reduced, but the state still needed resources to survive. Officials walked a fine line between extracting enough and not provoking rebellion. In this delicate dance, the Nilometer readings, as we saw in Story 2, played a crucial role, guiding the balance of demand and supply. What is striking is not the cruelty or leniency of the system, but its persistence. For over 2,000 years, Egypt's tax apparatus endured, adapting to new rulers, new gods, and new empires. The pharaohs were replaced by Persians, Greeks, and Romans, but the tax collectors remained. Each new ruler tapped into the same machinery, drawing wealth from the same peasants through the same scribal records. Dynasties came and went, but the bureaucracy endured like the river itself. And so the story of Egyptian administration is not one of drama, but of monotony. It is the story of scribes hunched over papyrus, of tax collectors tallying sacks of grain, of farmers grumbling under the burden. It is a story measured not in battles or conquests, but in numbers and lists. And yet without this monotony, the grandeur of Egypt would never have been possible. Still, one must ask, how did Egyptians themselves view this endless cycle? Did they see it as justice, as part of Ma'at, the divine order? Or did they see it as oppression, the weight of the state pressing on their backs? Did the tax collector represent stability or exploitation? To answer this, we must turn to the voices that remain the satirical texts, the complaints, the records of punishment, and the glimpses of resistance. These show us not only how the system worked, but how it felt to those who lived under it. Section 2. The burden of the scribes. If the tax collector was the face of the state, the scribe was its voice, its memory, and its unyielding hand. Without scribes, taxation would have been impossible. They were the ones who transformed the toil of farmers into numbers on papyrus, the ones who ensured that no sack of grain, no ox, no jar of oil went unrecorded. But for those who lived under this system, the bureaucracy was not only a matter of scribes and collectors, it was a daily weight, sometimes crushing, sometimes tolerated, and sometimes resisted. Let us begin with the image that comes down to us from tomb paintings and papyri the peasant brought before officials. His goods measured his body, bent under the strain. In one famous satirical text, the satire of the trades written in the Middle Kingdom, a schoolboy is told that the life of a scribe is far better than that of a farmer. The farmer, it says, is yoked more heavily than an ox, his neck bowed down under the weight of taxes. The text is propaganda for the scribal class, but it also reveals a truth. Farmers bore the heaviest burden of taxation, and they knew it. The system was designed to leave little room for evasion. After harvest, officials moved from village to village, measuring fields and recording yields. Teams of scribes double-checked each other's work. If discrepancies arose, inspections followed. Farmers who failed to deliver their quota might face confiscation of tools, livestock, or even land. In harsher cases, punishments included beatings, a fact depicted bluntly in tomb reliefs. The bureaucracy recorded not only goods, but discipline. Yet resistance existed. Archaeological and textual evidence hints at peasants hiding grain, concealing livestock, or delaying delivery. Such acts rarely succeeded on a large scale. The system was too thorough, but they reveal the tension between state and subject. For the farmer, grain was not an abstract number. It was the bread his family ate, the beer they drank. Every sack taken as tax was food lost. It is not difficult to imagine the resentment simmering beneath the surface of official records. We can hear this resentment faintly, but clearly in the voices preserved in papyri. One text, known as the Eloquent Peasant, tells the story of a farmer wronged by a corrupt official. Though framed as a tale about justice, it reflects a real anxiety that those in power might exploit their control of goods. Other texts describe petitions to local governors, peasants, pleading for relief from excessive demands or corrupt collectors. These are not rebellions, but small acts of protest attempts to appeal to Ma'at, the ideal of balance and fairness that underpinned Egyptian order. The bureaucracy's response to such tension was twofold: discipline and ideology. Discipline came through inspections, audits, and punishments. Ideology came through the constant insistence that taxation was not exploitation, but divine order. Inscriptions emphasize that the pharaoh feeds his people and opens the granaries in times of need. Hymns describe him as the protector of the poor, the guarantor of plenty. Taxes were framed not as theft, but as the pharaoh fulfilling his sacred duty. To resist the collector, then, was not only to resist the state, but to resist Ma'at itself. Still, ideology could not erase reality. Famine years reveal the strain most clearly. When floods were low, harvests small, and granaries thin, the state faced a dilemma. Reduce taxes, and the bureaucracy might falter. Demand too much, and peasants might rebel or die. Records suggest that in some years, taxes were indeed adjusted downward, but rarely enough to ease the full burden. The people bore the loss while the state tried to preserve itself. In such times, tax collectors became symbols not of order, but of oppression, arriving at villages already hollowed by hunger. The monotony of the system is striking when seen across centuries. The same complaints, the same punishments, the same justifications repeat in texts from the Old Kingdom to the New Kingdom and beyond. Dynasties changed gods, rose and fell. Foreign rulers came, yet the farmer, still bent under his tax. The scribe still wrote his numbers. The granary still swallowed its sacks. The persistence of this system is both its strength and its burden. One might ask, did Egyptians accept this as inevitable? The evidence suggests a mix of resignation and quiet resistance. Most complied for survival depended on it. Some tried to cheat the system in small ways, hiding grain or offering bribes. A few protested, writing petitions or appealing to officials. Rarely larger unrest erupted, usually in times of famine or political collapse. But on the whole, the system endured not because it was loved, but because it was inescapable. The satirical texts of the scribes give us a window into how the bureaucracy saw itself. In one humorous papyrus, a scribe mocks a farmer's misery, describing him bent under the weight of taxation, while the scribe enjoys comfort. The message is clear. The pen is mightier than the plow, the scribe superior to the peasant. This smugness, preserved in ink, shows us how the bureaucracy justified itself. To record was to rule, and those who wrote believed themselves above those who toiled. And yet even scribes were bound by the system. They were not free agents, but servants of the state, their ink as controlled as the farmer's grain. They recorded, audited, and checked their lives, consumed by endless repetition. The pride of their profession did not erase the monotony of their work. Year after year, they copied the same lists, sealed the same doors, checked the same measures. In their neat hieratic script, we glimpse both precision and tedium. Perhaps this is the true character of Egyptian administration, a vast machinery of monotony endured by peasants, maintained by scribes, justified by priests, and claimed by kings. It was not dramatic, but it was effective. It kept Egypt fed temples, supplied armies marching, and monuments rising. The tax collector, unpopular though he was the hinge on which the state turned. But we are left with the question, did this bureaucracy create stability, or did it mask fragility? Was Egypt strong because of its administration, or was it brittle, its people crushed under a weight that only seemed eternal? That question leads us to the final part of this story, where we will see how Egypt's administrative system endured collapse, foreign conquest, and centuries of change, and what that endurance tells us about the strange resilience of monotony. Section 3. Continuity and collapse. Administration is not glamorous. It does not glitter like gold in a tomb, nor tower like a pyramid on the desert horizon. Yet without it, there would have been no Egypt as we know it. The scribes, collectors, and overseers, those uncelebrated servants of the state, were the quiet engine that turned harvests into monuments. And though dynasties fell, foreign kings ruled, and temples crumbled, the machinery of taxation endured. To see this clearly, we must trace the bureaucracy across the great shifts of Egyptian history. In the Old Kingdom, taxation was primarily about feeding the royal court and sustaining monumental building projects. Farmers delivered grain cattle and linen to the pharaoh's estates, where scribes counted and redistributed them. Reliefs in tombs from this period show long processions of peasants, carrying offerings, each item carefully labeled by scribes. This was not merely artistic decoration, but an assertion. The wealth of Egypt flowed toward the king, organized by the bureaucracy. With the collapse of the Old Kingdom around 2200 BCE, central authority weakened. Provinces or nomes became more autonomous, their local governors collecting taxes for themselves, rather than the pharaoh. Yet the system itself did not vanish. Farmers still paid scribes, still recorded, and granaries still filled. Even in times of famine and political disunity, the bureaucratic rhythm endured at the local level. The state might falter, but the tax collector remained. The Middle Kingdom restored central power, and with it came refinements in administration. Surviving papyri from this period, such as the Hekanacht letters, show us landowners calculating rents, scribes auditing accounts, and officials balancing quotas. Taxes became more systematized, and inspections more regular. For the peasant, this likely meant greater predictability, but also greater scrutiny. The bureaucracy had learned from collapse order was maintained not by force alone, but by endless paperwork. The New Kingdom expanded Egypt's horizons. Conquests in Nubia and the Levant brought tribute in the form of grain, livestock, and luxury goods. Temples grew immensely wealthy, their estates rivaling those of the crown. Taxes supported armies, foreign expeditions, and colossal building projects like Karnak and Abu Simbel. Yet the core mechanism remained the same: peasants harvesting fields, scribes tallying sacks, officials sealing granaries. Even in an age of empire, the state rested on the same monotonous cycle. It was in this period, however, that cracks began to show. Corruption became more visible, with records describing missing rations, diverted grain, and dishonest officials. The strike at Deir el-Medina, when artisans walked off their work on royal tombs due to unpaid rations, reveals how dependent the system was on regular distribution. The bureaucracy, vast though it was, could falter when famine, mismanagement, or corruption intervened. With the late period came foreign domination. Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans each took control of Egypt. Yet none dismantled the tax system. On the contrary, they relied on it. The Persians demanded tribute in grain, collected through the same scribal apparatus. The Ptolemies, Greek rulers, after Alexander the Great, expanded the system, further introducing new taxes on everything from land to trade. Papyri from this era reveal an explosion of documentation, with receipts for taxes paid in grain money or goods. The monotony grew even denser, wrapping daily life in layers of bureaucracy. The Romans, too, recognized Egypt as the empire's breadbasket. Grain shipments from Alexandria fed Rome itself, and the annual tax collection became critical to imperial stability. The Nilometer readings guided quotas, and peasants once again carried their grain to granaries recorded by scribes. The language on the papyri changed from hieratic to Greek to Latin, but the system remained. The farmer still bent under his sack, the scribe still dipped his pen in ink, the granary still filled. What does this persistence tell us? On one hand, it shows the resilience of bureaucracy. Egypt's tax system survived because it was practical, efficient, and adaptable. It did not depend on a single dynasty or ideology. It was a machine that any ruler could operate. Pharaoh, Persian satrap, Greek king, or Roman emperor all used the same mechanism to extract wealth from the land. Bureaucracy was the true continuity of Egypt, more enduring than any monument. On the other hand, this persistence also reveals fragility. Bureaucracy could grind on, even in times of hardship, but it did not prevent collapse. Famine still struck, corruption still spread, invasions still succeeded. The tax system ensured survival most years, but it could not stop disaster when nature or politics turned against it. Its endurance was not proof of strength, but of necessity. The peasants still had to eat, the scribes still had to write, the rulers still had to collect. The cycle continued because it could not be stopped, not because it was unbreakable. For the ordinary Egyptian, the monotony of taxation must have felt eternal. Generations passed, dynasties rose and fell, yet the same cycle endured. A peasant in the Old Kingdom, bent under his sack of grain, would have recognized the burden of a peasant in the Roman period. The names of rulers changed, but the weight of harvest remained. The continuity was, in its way, a kind of oppression, life reduced to production measurement and deduction year after year. And yet the system also provided stability. The very monotony that burdened peasants also sustained them. Taxes fed armies that defended borders, granaries that relieved famine, temples that anchored communities. The bureaucracy ensured not only the wealth of rulers, but the survival of millions. It was dull, repetitive, often harsh, but it worked for over 3,000 years. So what is the legacy of the pharaoh's tax collectors? Perhaps it is the reminder that civilization is built as much on monotony as on brilliance. We remember Egypt for its pyramids and art, but those wonders were possible only because farmers delivered their grain, scribes recorded it, and officials redistributed it. The grand depended on the tedious, the spectacular on the routine. And perhaps this raises a final question in our own time. Surrounded by paperwork, taxes, and bureaucracy, do we see only the burden, or do we recognize, as the Egyptians did, that monotony can also be the backbone of survival? Story 5. Mud reeds and bricks, the forgotten builders of the Nile Valley, Section 1. The river's gift. When you think of ancient Egyptian architecture, your mind probably goes first to stone, the pyramids, temples, obelisks, and statues, carved from limestone, granite, or sandstone. But in truth, stone was the exception. Most Egyptians lived, worked, and worshipped in buildings made not of enduring blocks, but of mud brick and reeds. These humble materials, drawn directly from the Nile, built the houses of farmers, the workshops of artisans, the walls of cities, and even many temples and palaces. They were the fabric of everyday life, though few of these structures survive. The reason for this is simple. Mud brick crumbles while stone endures. The pyramids of Giza still stand after 500 years, but the mud brick homes of the workers who built them have long melted back into the earth. Yet those homes once stood in their thousands, lining the floodplain, rising in clusters along the edges of fields, packed within city walls. To understand ancient Egypt as it truly was, we must set aside the monuments of stone for a moment and turn to the quieter, humbler story of mud reeds and bricks. The Nile provided everything needed for this architecture. Each summer, as the river flooded, it deposited thick layers of silt along its banks. This silt, when mixed with water and straw, became the raw material for bricks. Reeds growing abundantly in marshes were cut and dried for mats, roofs, and reinforcement. Together, mud and reeds formed a building tradition that lasted for millennia. The Egyptians did not invent mud brick. It was used throughout the ancient Near East, but they perfected its use on a vast scale, adapting it to their climate, landscape, and needs. The process of making bricks was simple, but labor-intensive. First, workers dug clay-rich soil from pits near the river. This earth was mixed with water until it formed a thick paste. Straw or chaff was added to strengthen the mixture, preventing cracks as the bricks dried. The paste was then pressed into wooden molds, forming rectangular blocks. These bricks were left to dry in the sun, stacked in rows, until hardened. Once dry, they could be carried to building sites where they were laid in courses bound together with more mud. This work was often done not by skilled artisans, but by ordinary laborers, sometimes conscripted through the corvée system of state labor. In scenes carved on tomb walls, we see men stomping mud with their feet, filling molds, and carrying bricks on their shoulders. Their work was repetitive, heavy, and anonymous. Yet, without them, there would have been no houses, no walls, no granaries. The glory of Egypt rested quite literally on their backs. Mud brick was versatile. It could be used to build small one-room homes for farmers or sprawling palaces for kings. In villages, houses were often single-story with flat roofs made of reed mats plastered with mud. Families cooked on rooftops, slept in shaded courtyards, and stored grain in bins built into walls. In wealthier households, bricks were used to create multiple rooms, staircases, and even second stories. City walls, fortresses, and administrative buildings were also made of mud brick, sometimes faced with stone for durability. Reeds, too, were indispensable. Cut from marshes, bundled and tied, they were woven into mats used for roofs, floors, and partitions. They were also bound into ropes, baskets, and even boats. The reed was a plant of countless uses, as essential to Egyptian life as the date palm. Together with mud, it created a landscape of impermanent architecture structures designed not to last forever, but to serve immediate needs. The fragility of these materials might suggest poverty, but in truth, mud brick architecture was well suited to the environment. Egypt's dry climate meant that mud brick buildings could last for decades, or even centuries if maintained. The thick walls provided insulation against the desert heat, keeping interiors cool. Repairs were easy. New bricks could be made and added as needed. For most Egyptians, mud brick was not a poor substitute for stone, but the natural choice. Stone was reserved for temples, tombs, and monuments meant to last for eternity. Mud brick was for the living. The contrast between stone and mud brick reveals much about Egyptian values. Monuments for the gods and the dead were built to endure, reflecting the eternal nature of divine order and the afterlife. Homes, workshops, and palaces were built to serve the living, and their impermanence was accepted. To us, the loss of these structures seems like a gap in history, but to the Egyptians, it was simply the way of things. Life was fleeting, the afterlife eternal. Architecture followed that principle. Yet, traces of mud brick survive. Archaeologists at sites like Amarna, the short-lived capital of Akhenaten, have uncovered entire city blocks of mud brick houses. Their walls, though crumbling, still show the outlines of doorways, courtyards, and storage rooms. At Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb builders, mud brick houses stand almost intact, revealing the daily lives of artisans, rooms for cooking, sleeping, and storing grain, with small altars for household gods. These sites remind us that most Egyptians lived not in stone monuments, but in mud brick homes, surrounded by reed mats, clay ovens, and the smell of baking bread. Mud brick also built Egypt's infrastructure. Granaries with their domed or vaulted roofs were constructed of brick. So were storage magazines, administrative offices, and military forts. Along the desert's edge, mud brick walls enclosed temples and towns. Even when stone temples rose within their outer precincts, were often walled with mud brick. Palaces, too, were usually built of brick with stone columns or facades added for grandeur. What we see today, as ruins of stone, were once surrounded by vibrant brick buildings, painted and plastered full of life. The monotony of mud brick construction is easy to imagine. Men mixing mud, stamping it with straw, pressing it into molds, lifting heavy bricks, stacking them into walls. Day after day, year after year, the same cycle repeated. It was not glamorous, but it was essential. For every pyramid, There were 1,000 mud brick houses. For every temple, 100 granaries. Egypt's survival depended less on stone monuments than on mud brick walls that sheltered families, stored food, and defined communities. But how did the builders themselves view their work? Did they take pride in structures destined to crumble? Or did they resent the endless labor? Did they think of their bricks as temporary? Or did they see them as part of a larger, enduring order? These questions remind us that mud brick architecture was not only a material fact, but a social reality, shaping the lives of those who built and lived within it. And so we arrive at the heart of this story, the forgotten builders of the Nile Valley who worked in mud and reeds rather than stone and gold. Their story is not one of monuments that endure forever, but of homes and walls that rose and fell with the floods rebuilt, generation after generation. But what did it mean in social and cultural terms to live in a world of impermanent buildings? How did mud brick and reeds shape the identity of Egyptians, their sense of time and their view of life and death? That is where we must turn next. Section 2. Homes of Mud and Reed. To understand the true architecture of ancient Egypt, you must step away from the stone temples and monuments, and instead picture yourself in a village along the Nile. The river is close by its waters, glinting in the sun. Beyond the fields of barley and emmer wheat, clusters of low mud brick houses rise, their walls plastered white, their flat roofs lined with reed mats. Narrow lanes wind between them, shaded in places by wooden beams that support awnings. Chickens dart through the streets, children chase each other barefoot, and the smell of bread baking drifts from clay ovens. This was the world most Egyptians knew, not the grandeur of Karnak or the pyramids, but the modest comfort of mud brick homes. These houses were not built to last centuries. They were built to shelter families through the seasons. Yet within their walls, entire lives unfolded, with rhythms as steady as the floods of the Nile. The structure of a house. A typical house began with a foundation of mud brick laid on packed earth. The walls rose a meter thick, providing insulation against the desert heat. The floors were also made of packed earth, sometimes covered with reed mats. The roof was flat, made of wooden beams, often palm trunks covered with layers of reeds and coated with mud plaster. This flat surface became an extension of the home itself, a place to dry grain, sleep on hot nights, or gather with neighbors. Inside the house was arranged around a central room with smaller rooms branching off. A small hearth or clay oven might stand in one corner for cooking, while storage bins held grain and jars of beer. Niches in the walls could hold lamps or small figurines of household gods. The walls were often plastered smooth and sometimes whitewashed, reflecting light into otherwise dim interiors. The homes of wealthier families might include multiple rooms a second story, or even staircases leading to rooftop terraces. They might also have painted walls decorated with geometric designs or floral patterns. But whether simple or elaborate, all shared the same essential elements: mud reeds, plaster, and patience. Daily life in mud brick. The daily life of a household revolved around these spaces. In the morning, women ground grain on stone querns, their rhythmic motions filling the air with a dull scraping sound. Children fetched water from the river, carrying it in clay jars, balanced on their hips. Men tended the fields or worked in workshops, while women baked bread, brewed beer, and wove linen. The house was not only a shelter, but a workplace. Ovens smoked, looms clattered, and storage bins filled. Meals were eaten in the central room or on rooftops, often consisting of bread, beer, onions, and perhaps a bit of fish. The scent of baking bread was constant, the oven fueled by dried dung or reeds. Beer, thick and nourishing, was brewed in jars left to ferment and ladled out for both children and adults. In these houses, sustenance, and survival were woven into the walls themselves. The fragility of mud brick meant that repairs were constant. After a flood or a heavy rain, walls cracked, roofs leaked, and plaster flaked away. Families patched holes with fresh mud, laid new reeds on roofs, and reapplied plaster. This cycle of maintenance was never-ending, but it was accepted as part of life. To live in a mud brick house was to live with impermanence, to accept that one's home would require as much care as the fields or the hearth. Neighborhoods and community houses rarely stood alone. They clustered together in neighborhoods sharing walls to conserve space and resources. Narrow lanes twisted between them, filled with the sounds of animals, children, and conversation. Privacy, as we understand it, was limited. Neighbors shared ovens, water jars, and work. Life was communal, shaped by the architecture of mud brick. At sites like Deir el Medina, the village of royal tomb builders, archaeologists have uncovered entire streets of mud brick houses. These homes, though modest, were surprisingly uniform, long, narrow layouts, with front rooms, central courtyards, and rear storage areas. The uniformity suggests planning, perhaps by the state itself. The village was not a random cluster of houses, but a deliberately organized community, shaped by brick walls and shared labor. In larger towns, mud brick also formed the fabric of public life. Administrative offices, granaries, and even temples were often built of brick, their interiors bustling with scribes, priests, and officials. The walls of cities like Tel El Amarna rose in long stretches of mud brick, enclosing palaces, workshops, and markets. Within these walls, the daily hum of life unfolded: merchants shouting prices, donkeys braying, scribes reading out decrees. Stone temples might dominate the skyline, but mud brick filled the streets. The social meaning of brick architecture was not only functional, but symbolic. Stone was for eternity, mud brick for the present. This division mirrored Egyptian ideas of time: jet eternal, unchanging, and nehe cyclical, ever renewing. Tombs and temples built in stone belonged to Jat. Houses built in mud brick belonged to Nehe. They were part of the cycle of flood and harvest, birth and death, repair and rebuilding. The Egyptians did not mourn the impermanence of their homes. They understood it as part of life's rhythm. Even so, mud brick could carry prestige. Large estates, palaces, and temples often used brick on a grand scale, their walls towering above villages. Palaces at Amarna and Malkata, though, built largely of mud brick, were painted with bright colors, decorated with frescoes, and adorned with stone doorways. These structures, though impermanent, projected wealth and power. For the builders, the same humble bricks that built a farmer's hut also built a king's palace, reminding us that status was measured not in material, but in scale. The builders themselves, who built these mud brick houses, walls, and palaces. The answer, as always, is laborers, ordinary men and women, whose names rarely survive. Some were hired craftsmen skilled in bricklaying and plastering. Many more were conscripted peasants, fulfilling their labor tax through construction. Scenes on tomb walls show teams of workers mixing mud, filling molds, and carrying bricks in baskets slung over their shoulders. Overseers stand nearby, whips in hand, ensuring the pace is kept. The labor was repetitive, heavy, and uncelebrated. Bricks were molded by the hundreds, stacked in the sun, carried in endless procession to build walls that might crumble within a generation. Yet this monotony was the backbone of Egyptian life. For every grand temple, there were thousands of modest homes. For every stone monument, 100 mud brick walls rose and fell. The forgotten builders were those who labored in silence, their work erased by time. A life built on impermanence. To live in a mud brick house was to live with constant repair, with walls that cracked, roofs that sagged, and plaster that flaked away. Yet it was also to live with adaptability. A new room could be added. A roof raised, a courtyard expanded. Families shaped their homes to their needs, and when walls finally collapsed, new bricks could be made and the house rebuilt. This cycle mirrored the floods of the Nile destruction and renewal loss, and abundance endlessly repeated. And here we arrive at an essential truth. Mud brick architecture was not a weakness of Egyptian civilization, but its strength. It allowed flexibility, growth, and resilience. It tied life to the rhythms of the river, acknowledging impermanence, while embracing renewal. But what did this mean for identity? How did Egyptians, living in houses destined to crumble, understand themselves in contrast to the eternity of stone temples and tombs? Did they see their lives as fleeting shadows beneath the eternal monuments? Or did they find dignity in the impermanence of their own walls? That question leads us to the final part of this story, where we must consider how mud brick and reed architecture shaped not only daily life, but the Egyptian understanding of time, memory, and what it meant to build a civilization. Section 3. Impermanence and Eternity. When we look back at ancient Egypt, we tend to be dazzled by what endures. We see pyramids of limestone and temples of sandstone, carved deep with hieroglyphs that still speak across thousands of years. Yet, if we wish to understand how Egyptians actually lived, we must look instead at what does not endure, at the houses of mud brick and roofs of reed that sheltered their families. These were the true architecture of Egypt, and their impermanence was not a flaw, but a reflection of Egyptian life itself. The fragility of mud brick. Mud brick architecture was always vulnerable. Rain, though rare, could dissolve walls. Floods washed away houses along the riverbanks. Heat cracked plaster, and winds eroded surfaces. Repairs were constant. Every season brought new patches of mud, new layers of plaster, new bundles of reeds laid on roofs. To live in such a house was to live in a state of continual renewal, accepting that one's walls were never truly finished. Archaeologists uncovering these remains often find collapsed walls, piles of crumbled mud, and only the faintest outlines of rooms. Yet sometimes the traces are surprisingly vivid. At Amarna, the capital of Akhenaten, entire neighborhoods of mud brick houses have been excavated, revealing streets, courtyards, ovens, and even painted wall fragments. At Deir el-Medina, the workers' village near Thebes, houses still stand waist-high, their rooms clearly defined. In these spaces, we glimpse daily life jars left in corners, grinding stones, worn smooth stairs, leading to vanished roofs. These fragile remains remind us that Egypt was not only temples and tombs, but kitchens and courtyards, storage bins and staircases. The division of stone and brick. The Egyptians were fully aware of the difference between stone and brick. They reserved stone for eternity, temples for the gods, tombs for the dead, monuments for the ages. These structures were meant to last forever, embodying Jet, the eternal, unchanging order. Mud brick, by contrast, belonged to Nehe, the cyclical time of life, death, and renewal. Homes, palaces, granaries, and walls were part of this cycle, built to serve the present, rebuilt when they fell, never expected to endure forever. This division shaped Egyptian identity. People lived in houses of brick, prayed in temples of stone, and were buried in tombs of stone. Their daily lives were impermanent, their eternal lives permanent. They accepted that their homes would crumble, but they trusted that their tombs would endure. The materials themselves reflected a philosophy of existence, the transient and the eternal, side by side. The builder's legacy. What then of the builders themselves, the men who mixed mud, pressed it into molds, and carried bricks on their shoulders? Their work was anonymous, their names rarely recorded. They did not carve their names into the bricks, nor were their deeds celebrated in inscriptions. Yet they shaped Egypt far more than the famous architects and kings. Every village, every wall, every granary and palace rose from their labor. Their legacy lies not in monuments that still stand, but in the countless generations of lives they sheltered. One might wonder how these builders felt about their impermanent work. Did they resent the endless cycle of mixing molding and stacking bricks that would soon crumble? Or did they find satisfaction in the act of building itself, knowing that their work sustained families, communities, and cities? The truth is hidden, but the persistence of mud brick architecture across millennia suggests a deep cultural acceptance. To build and rebuild was not futility, it was life, memory, and forgetfulness. Because mud brick decays, most of Egypt's daily life has been forgotten. The great temples survive, the humble houses do not. This creates an illusion that Egypt was a land of eternal stone, when in fact it was a land of fragile brick. The survival of monuments has distorted our memory, elevating kings and gods while obscuring farmers, builders, and families. Yet, in their time, the mud brick houses were far more numerous, far more essential. They were the Egypt that people actually lived in. This imbalance raises questions about how civilizations are remembered, what survives and what is lost. Do we know the real Egypt, or only the Egypt of eternity? The crumbled bricks invisible beneath the sands whisper a reminder. History is not only what endures, but also what is forgotten. A civilization of cycles. Perhaps the most profound lesson of mud brick and reed architecture is how it embodied the Egyptian sense of cycles. Each year, the Nile flooded and reseeded fields were sown, and harvested houses repaired and rebuilt. The impermanence of mud brick mirrored the impermanence of life itself. Just as walls crumbled and were remade, so too did lives end, and souls pass into eternity. Egyptians embraced this cycle, finding in it not despair, but order. Stone and brick together formed a complete vision of existence. Stone promised eternity. Brick provided life. One without the other would have been incomplete. The grandeur of pyramids and temples was possible only because mud brick houses sheltered the workers, granaries stored their food, and reed mats covered their roofs. The eternal was sustained by the temporary. The reflection for us as we reflect on Egypt's forgotten builders. We might ask ourselves, what are our own mud bricks? What parts of our lives are built to endure? And what parts are built only for the present? We live in an age of concrete and steel, yet much of our world, our houses, our cities, even our digital records may not last as long as we imagine. Like the Egyptians, we build both for the moment and for eternity, often without realizing which is which. The mud brick houses of Egypt remind us that impermanence is not failure. To build knowing that what you build will crumble is not futility. It is resilience. It is the acceptance that life is a cycle of making, unmaking, and remaking. The Egyptians knew this, and they built their civilization on it. So perhaps the final lesson of mud reeds and bricks is, a civilization does not endure only in its monuments. It endures in the daily lives of its people, in the houses they build, the bread they bake, the walls they repair, and the resilience with which they accept impermanence. And the question remains, when future generations look back at us, will they see only our monuments of steel and glass, or will they also remember the fragile bricks of our daily lives? End of story. Wish you have a sweet dreams.